It's Remembrance Day in Canada. And on Remembrance Day, instead of filling it with endless platitudes and empty gestures, I think we should focus on what more we can do for our veterans. Housing First programs for homeless veterans is a step in the right direction. And of course, later on in the show, I'll be discussing a potential solution for PTSD, which of course many veterans suffer from. But also, as my next guest writes, quote, we need to remember not just the sacrifices of soldiers, but also the extraordinary resolve our society showed the last time it faced an existential threat. Those words from Robert Green, teacher at Westmount High School in Montreal and a contributor to Ricochet.media and the writer of the opinion piece titled Shared Sacrifices of the Past Show Way Forward on Climate. Robert, welcome to the show.
How you doing?
Doing great. So your piece really stood out to me. You make a connection that I don't often see, and that's connecting World War to climate change. So explain how you see that connection and why we should be taking climate change as seriously as a new world war.
Well, I have to say I can't take credit for sort of making that connection myself. I mean, I first heard David Suzuki making that connection recently. And before that, people like Noam Chomsky have also been making that connection in their public statements. And, I think it's an important connection to make because we've just had this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that is really awake. It's an alarming statement and a call for humanity to act. And the consequences of not acting are cataclysmic on a level that makes the threat posed by Nazism seem small, and that's an almost unthinkable thing to say when you consider what that threat represented in our world. Mm-hmm. So what the IPCC has said is that we have 12 years to reduce global emissions by 45%, and until 2050 to reduce them further by 100%. So this is the kind of action, or this is the kind of a target that is not going to require small actions. This is we need to fundamentally change the way that we're doing things. And I think the kind of actions that we took, during the Second World War, we need to look back on and be inspired by.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you think Canada fares so far in terms of their action on climate change? Clearly, I think I can assume you don't think we're going far enough. But what do you think Canada and the world really has done to try and combat this, and what more should we do?
Well, we've set some targets, but we really haven't done enough at all to make the fundamental changes in our economy. So, I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, just, we in Canada subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of about $3.3 billion a year. Mm-hmm. Imagine what that amount of money could do in terms of subsidies for green industry that would be creating jobs and not threatening the planet. Just for example, I mean, the geothermal potential here in Canada is enormous, and Iceland back in the 70s made major investments to shift over its public buildings over to geothermal. And has been reaping the rewards since, both for the environment and for their economy. So we have to look at doing those sorts of things. And so, but in addition to the $3.3 billion in subsidies we've got, our prime minister has just bought a pipeline for $4.5 billion. Right?
That pipeline is ridiculous.
A pipeline that no oil company would invest in because it was so risky economically. And so this is something that's as potentially as disastrous for Canada's economy as it is cataclysmic for the world. So we in Canada, we have a disproportionate effect in terms of our carbon footprint, and that means I think we have a responsibility to be world leaders, in this struggle.
Yeah, and Canada were world leaders on this issue in the 80s, and it seems like we kind of fell off since then.
Absolutely. And if you look at the action that was initiated by Canada to take care of the ozone layer, I mean, that has yielded success. I mean, they're saying like the ozone layer is now fixed. So, collective action works. But what is missing is the political will. And that's what's needed. And I think, also we need to look at the sorts of things our governments did during the Second World War to ensure victory. And that was to intervene in the economy. Like, we didn't sort of mess around with worrying about whether or not certain actions would, offend the tenets of free market ideology.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So,
right.
In the piece, you talk about the strong government intervention during the World War and how the Crown corporations and Bank of Canada, what they were doing during wartime. Can you sort of go into that and give people this perspective of how big of a deal that was in terms of what they were doing at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you have to consider that, at this point in Canada's history, we were just, coming out of the Great Depression, and suddenly we had these enormous needs for war production. And so the question was sort of how to fund that. And, our government, to its credit, I think, came up with a very good idea and, founded a public bank. And, the purpose of the Bank of Canada, as written right into its own charter, was to give loans to the different levels of government, to, I think, first the federal and provincial, and I think later even municipal governments were getting in on it. And they got interest-free loans that would be paid back, but that, for that time could be used to ramp up war production, to create these crown corporations that were doing everything from, building new homes for the industrial workforce to actually producing, weapons and vehicles and clothing and equipment and all the things that were needed for war. Mm-hmm. And so, and the remarkable thing about this was, by simultaneously also regulating the private creation of money by, tightening the rules on the banks, this didn't cause any inflation to happen. Like that's always the big worry that people always raise when you talk about, government basically printing money and spending it into existence. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a little bit different than that in that it's loaning money to itself. So eventually that money comes back out of the supply. But for a time it's in there. But, to accomplish that without inflation, you just tighten up the private creation of money being done by the banks. So, and so this not only allowed us to achieve a remarkable level of production throughout the entire war, but it also fueled the post-war boom. We built all of Canada's infrastructure in that area, and this was basically the period where Canada's middle class emerged. And it was largely because the government was busy doing things like building memorial hockey arenas, and all the hospitals and schools that are in Canada were largely built in this post-war era. And it was all being accomplished with interest-free loans from the Bank of Canada. And so, and it's something that we stopped doing, sadly, in the 1970s. Pierre Trudeau signed an international agreement saying that we would not use the Bank of Canada in this way anymore. And since then, what's happened? We've had skyrocketing debts. We have crumbling infrastructure. And, we see we have a whole lot of needs. Public programs are being hit with austerity. So, what I think is needed right now is basically a big push and an infusion of government money on the level that we did in the lead up to the Second World War and after, and to rapidly transform our economy into one that is not threatening our collective survival.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking with Robert Greene, writer of Shared Sacrifices of the Past, Show Way Forward on Climate, which you can read on ricochet.media. So in your piece, you also say, and this is sort of an extension of what you were saying, You say, quote, part of the reason remembering is so important to many is that it reminds us of what we are capable of achieving through our collective sacrifices.
Yeah.
So in terms of our collective sacrifices, is this, do you mean this in terms of what the government has to sort of invest, or also the sacrifice of the citizens of Canada?
Both. I mean, and that's, again, what was so remarkable about the war effort, is that we were sort of demanding that our political leadership do whatever it takes for victory. And simultaneously, Canadians were also getting involved in all kinds of ways, from purchasing war bonds to doing things like, saving scrap metal, and even things like bacon grease were getting recycled for the war effort. So that is kind of what we need right now. I think too much of the emphasis on sort of how to improve our environmental situation has been put solely on sort of individual consumer actions. And these are important. I don't want to say that's not important, but I think much more important is the sort of collective actions that we take, and the action of, sort of first and foremost, demanding that our government make this a priority, because, as the IPCC has said, time is running out. And we're already seeing the consequences of this. Like, my God, in the news today, hearing the voices of people out of Paradise, California, who have their entire community just burnt to the ground. And it's what we've been seeing in BC. I mean, in the last 2 years, over 1 million hectares of forest have burned, 2 seasons in a row. So, we're already living the consequences, and those are just going to increase. And so it's not something that we can be messing around with. I mean, I think Trudeau's move for a carbon tax is a step forward, but it's not enough.
Yeah,
we need to be doing sort of much more than that. Again, like, a 45% reduction in 12 years is a pretty tall order.
So I always struggle with how to exactly communicate how important the climate crisis is and our need to address it. How do you think the media should improve their approach to covering climate change and make it as urgent as an issue as, say, pointing out when Hitler was the enemy?
Well, I think part of it has to be in doing a better job of connecting the dots. I mean, I think too often a lot of the events that are reported are sort of reported as, tragic incidences without sort of always, first and foremost, making the connection that these things that are happening are a product of climate change, and that this is going to be happening more and more. And I think doing much more to give voice to the courageous scientists that are ringing the alarm bells about this. I mean, some of the things I've been reading is that they're in a state of personal crisis with, observing the data that they're seeing, because it's it's unimaginable what the implications are. And I think we all have an obligation to look at that data ourselves, and the media has a role to put that in our face, because that's what's going to hopefully cajole us into acting and making us demand of our political leaders to make this the only priority if necessary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree. I've seen a lot of coverage on these forest fires in California, and a lot of images of fire and burning houses and burned out cars, but very little connecting it to actual the issue of climate change and showing that this is happening because of climate change, and we need to address this as a serious issue. Otherwise, this will continue to be a problem. The droughts, there's endless, really, the hurricanes. It's really endless in terms of what this has, how this has impacted us. And the media needs to do a better job at connecting all of these issues. So,
exactly.
Do you think there's anything people at home could do to try and push their government and maybe the media and society in general to take climate change more seriously?
Well, I think the upcoming federal election is going to be a chance for people to make this an issue. I think we need to reject, all of the parties that are talking about a status quo where oil companies continue to be subsidized with billions of dollars of our tax money that could be used to create the kind of sustainable economy that hopefully will be there for future generations.
Yeah, and I saw you at the end of your piece. You discussed briefly the protests that were happening around Quebec as well. So I think that's also an important point to push on to make sure people actually get out there in the streets.
Exactly, and it was an enormous turnout. We had tens of thousands of people out in the streets here in Montreal, and then other demos happening in cities throughout Quebec. And I think that also has to be part of it. Like, this needs to be a social movement that is both acting in the electoral sphere, but also even considering things like civil disobedience to put pressure on to force changes in our society.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Robert Greene is a Montreal teacher, blogger at Montreal Teachers for Change, and is the writer of the opinion piece titled Shared Sacrifices of the Past Show Way Forward on Climate on Ricochet.media. Robert, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.